Hey, what's going on, everyone? So we are finally at the point in this class where we get to start writing some SQL code and creating our own databases. So the modules for this week, there are no reading assignments from books 24/7 this week, and the reading modules are really easy to follow. So I'm not going to go through a lot of this stuff detail by detail. So I just want to cover some very important points on a lot of this stuff and make sure that we are clear on a lot of these concepts before you guys start writing code. So, of course, to create our database, we're going to be using data definition language, or DDL, that includes the create, alter, drop, grant, and revoke commands in our code, and we'll see how to use a lot of those here pretty shortly. So one important point that I want to make, and this is going to be very important for project 2, is that the syntax is pretty critical. Now, most environments is not case sensitive when you're writing your SQL code, so you can write your create table and alter table and all of that in lowercase. However, it's a good idea to get into the habit of using the proper syntax when writing your code. So make sure that all of the keywords in your SQL scripts have those keywords in capital letters. Now the table names and things like that can be of lowercase or alternating uppercase to lowercase. Just make sure that you have those keywords in uppercase. That's very important. So, and every command in SQL is followed by a semicolon. That's going to be very important, and it's going to be important to note when commands end and when lines end, and we'll see that when we start entering data and creating our databases. So, in order to convert our entities into relations, we have to go through certain steps. Now, of course, there are some computer-aided software engineering tools out there that do all that for you. You can create your ERD in that case tool, and then it'll create your database for you. They're really it's really sharp how those things work. But we're not going to be doing that. We're going to be writing our SQL code. It's really important to understand how that SQL code works in the background before you start using a lot of those case tools. So in your ERDs, and when you're looking at the relationships, the one side of the relationship is going to be where the primary key lives, and then on the many side, that is where the foreign key lives, and we'll kind of get into that here in just a moment when I start breaking down some SQL code for you guys. And now this week we talked about data types. Let me see if I can find something real quick on the data types. So under the first module under SQL, it has an area that defines some of the primary data types that we'll be using. Of course, there's char, varchar2, number, and date, and I'll demonstrate a few of these in a modified version of the code that I provided you before. So, and it's really important that you understand how those data types work. And now I mentioned during the chat session last week that the data types work very much like variables when you're writing code in Java or C++ and what have you. When that piece of data lands in memory, the memory allocated has to be given a specific data type, so it knows how much space to allocate and how that data is going to be used. For instance, if you are going to be performing mathematical operations on that value, you can't store that data by and large as a char or a varchar2. They have to be stored as some numerical value. So just keep that in mind, and make sure that you determine what attributes need to be what data type when you're building your code. So let's look at some code real quick, speaking of that. And this is, like I said, this is a modified version of the code that I provided you guys last week. So the same thing, I've got, I'm turning the spool command on to create a log file, and it's going to be very important that you guys do that using the drop tables. Now, one thing that I don't think I pointed out is that this portion here, to cascade constraints, that means regardless of what the constraints are, get rid of the table. And we do that 4 times for all the tables. So again, that removes that table regardless of what type of relationships it has with other relations in that database. So I've kind of modified this just a little bit. So previously I had the primary key being identified up here in this first line under the customer ID. Now that is still the primary key. However, I've just got that identified in a constraint down here at the bottom to identify what is now a new name, a primary key name, identifying the customer ID as that primary key. And I've done the same thing with pretty much all of these. Now, I want you to notice that down here we have 2 primary keys, which are order ID and product ID. So let's take a look real quick at the ERD for this database, and I'll post this up for you guys here shortly. But you'll notice that this table, the code in this SQL script should match this ERD perfectly. If not, please let me know, and I'll make some the proper alterations on that. But again, we can use this ERD to come up with this code, and basically we just use the proper table name. Of course, the entity name is going to be customer underscore E for entity, and then customer underscore T for table. And that's kind of how that transition happens. So let me see if there was anything else that I need to point out. One thing that I did use is that I have a date data type under the order. So this specifies when that input is placed in the database, it uses the date stamp of the system, the current date from the system, and I'll show you how that works here shortly. And then we've got a decimal number here at this location that sets the decimal number to 6 places with 2 decimal places, and we'll see how that works as well. And I think that's about all I have on that. So let's look at the code to actually enter that data. So similar to my the code that I used to create my database, I've got some commands here to delete all the records that might be in that table prior to trying to enter new records. Because if you try and enter records with the same primary key, it's not gonna work for you. So if you just use a command to delete from and the table name, and don't specify any kind of constraints on that command, it's going to delete every record out of that table. So be careful with that, and make sure that you understand that that is indeed the possibility, or what's going to happen. So let's see how this stuff works, and we will start running some commands. Of course, I'm going to use the porta putty supplied by University of Maryland, and log in with my account. Alright, and we are in the right spot. So you'll notice that I've got some files in here. I've already got some input data logs from inputting the data into the database, and I've got the dbcreate.log for creating that data file, or creating the database from the SQL script, that figure 4.6 SQL script. So let's open up our FTP utility. Okay. All right. So let me first make sure I've got my files in the right spot. Okay, so we'll refresh that one time, and you'll notice now that I've got a figure 4.6.SQL and an input data.SQL, which are these two guys here. So we will copy these over, click and drag that over and overwrite. Alright, and then copy the input data and overwrite that. And we'll go back to our Nova shell here. And log into SQL Plus. And you guys have already logged into this, I'm sure, and gotten all that stuff worked out. And then I will run my figure 4.6 SQL, and we will see that it dropped 4 tables and created 4 tables. So then we will run our input. Oops. Now, of course, since this is Unix, these are very case sensitive when running these commands, or running these scripts rather. Alright, so we'll see that now I have, like I said, at the very top, I have some commands to delete those any records that might be in there, and then I have 5 records per table that I've input into that database. So let's look at one of these tables, select everything from, and let's look at oops, the customer table. And of course, every command has to end with a semicolon. And you'll see that we've got a few customers named Gene Simmons, Paul Stanley, Peter Chris, Ace Frehley, and Tony Baird. And they've got some addresses and a customer ID. So let's then look at, let me move one of these guys over here. So we'll look at everything from the product table, and we've got in there product ID and then a description, which I've got blah blah blah, but that description could be pretty lengthy. It's got plenty of space to write a pretty lengthy description in there. So now notice that I've got some of these are set to a decimal dollar amount, like $600.99, and then I have 200, and then 99.95 and 250. So let's look at how that data is set up when going in. Now, this is going to be pretty important when you are inputting data. You'll need to make sure that the the data is configured in a certain way. Now, when you're using any kind of text, they need to be surrounded by single quotes. Now, if you use double quotes, Oracle thinks that you're trying to do something else with it, so just stick with the double quote, the single quotes rather. And so down here is for the product table, and you'll notice that I've got some prices here, and I've got $600.99, and then down here I've got 200. So I can alter that by changing that to $200.00 and 250.00. Oops, that's O. And save that guy, and I'll go back to my my core FTP and copy that guy over and overwrite that. And I'll run that script again to input the data. And oh, looks like I got an error, so let's take a look at that. Oh, I've got some constraints, some constraint violations. So let's take a look at what might be causing that. Okay, so I wanted to show you guys what the problem was there. So I actually had, I believe I had order table down below customer and the product table. So of course there are dependencies, there are constraints that have those foreign keys tied back to those primary keys in those other tables. So it's important to delete those in the proper order. So let's take a look at how that works, and you can do input. Oops. Let me show you something real quick. So this is you'll notice that I have one additional capital letter in there, and it's going to say, hey, I can't open that file because I don't see that, it's not out there. So like I mentioned, Unix is very case sensitive, so make sure that you are aware of that and run the scripts properly. So one other thing I wanted to show you real quick is that I don't know if you guys are at all familiar with Unix. You probably use VI. So I wanted to kind of show you how that works. So you can actually do all of your editing in this shell. Now it's kind of a pain to do that because the keystrokes for VI they're hard to get accustomed to. So you can go down here and move around, and you can delete characters with X and insert new characters with I. And when you finish making all of your changes, you can do Shift : and do a WQ bang, and that's right quit, and do that right now, and it'll save that file for you. So and again, you'll notice that I've got up here my spool command to input the input data.log, and that spools everything out to that file, which is right there. And let's take a look at that real quick. Actually, we can copy this guy over and open it up, and it's going to show you all the 5 rows that were deleted, and then the rows that were input before closing that spool file again. So I think that's all that I have. I will post these files out there. Now again, I'm not going to get into some of the other details of doing the select statements and all that kind of stuff, because those modules are really good about explaining how all that stuff works. Once you get your database built, my main interest today was to make sure that that you understand how to build that database and how to put data into that database. Now, one of the most important points, as I've mentioned, is to make sure that you have those relationships established between your databases. I'm sorry, between the relations. So in other words, you need to have a primary key for each relation, and then you need to have foreign keys tying back to the relation that that is supposed to be associated with, as defined in your ERD. So I think that's all that I have today. So you guys have fun with that, and if you haven't done so, make sure that you log into Nova and start putting these files out there that I'm going to give you, so you can kind of see how all this stuff works. Run some queries against it based on the direction in the online modules, and then start working on your own code. And if you have any questions, let me know.